Dr Jekyll and Mr Hyde, GCSE Grade 9 Essay. How is the natural and the supernatural world presented in the novel? Dr Jekyll and Mr Hyde is a classic Gothic novel, so the element of the supernatural will feature in this genre. Stevenson masterfully creates tension between the world of reason and the supernatural. The natural world, as seen through the eyes of the chief narrator, seems unable to cope or comprehend the sinister supernatural phenomena that occurs in the novel. The novel is mostly, chapter 2 to chapter 8, narrated through Mr. Utterson. He represents traditional Victorian society in the sense he never shows his feelings, is taciturn, and he is never lighted by a smile. Mr. Utterson behaves like a typical wealthy and educated Victorian gentleman. The duality of human nature in the novel is also accompanied by the duality of the natural or rational world with the supernatural. Gothic novels are usually set in remote castles, ruins, and wild and remote areas. However, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is set in Victorian London, and Stevenson uses nightmarish imagery, dark alleys, deep fog, derelict streets to create a sense of horror and fear. Hyde is an urban monster at home in the sinister darkness of London. Suspense is a key feature of the Gothic novel, and in Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, the reader is fascinated by the evil Mr. Hyde. After the brutal murder of Sir Danvers, despite a massive police hunt, Mr. Hyde disappeared as though he had never existed. The reader is intrigued about his whereabouts, and the shocking truth about him is revealed in the final 2 chapters. When Mr. Utterson suspects a wrongdoing, he does not try to understand why this has happened. For instance, when Dr. Hyde tells him never to talk about Mr. Hyde again, Mr. Utterson agrees. He is a lawyer and has a logical mind, but does not question his friend's ambiguous answers. When Mr. Utterson thinks Mr. Hyde is blackmailing his friend, he does not investigate. Also, when he suspects Dr. Jekyll of forging the letter protecting Mr. Hyde does not involve the police because he knows this may ruin his friend's reputation. Utterson is unable to comprehend the irrational or the supernatural events between Jekyll and Hyde. He thinks the estranged relationship between the two is criminal until the truth is revealed to him at the end of the novel. Mr. Utterson represents the Victorian belief that reason and common sense should always prevail. This could be one reason why Dr. Jekyll tells Mr. Utterson that he trusts him more than anyone else in the world, but cannot share his scientific ideas with him. Mr. Hyde appears to be a manifestation of the supernatural in Victorian London. His physical description transcends rational description, and everyone who describes him is intelligent and level-headed. Mr. Hyde is collectively described as possessing an inexplicable air of evil about him. This idea of incomprehensible ugliness intensifies the power of the supernatural over the natural. Mr. Hyde is described by all who have cast eyes on him as unhuman, a troglodyte, and someone with the mark of Satan on his face. He frequents the streets of London in the small hours and instills terror into everyone who interacts with him. After the brutal murder of Sir Danvers Carew, Mr. Hyde disappears as if he had never existed. This not only adds suspense to the novel, but intensifies the supernatural aspect of Mr. Hyde. Mr. Utterson still tries to look for a rational explanation. In fact, he does not want to take any drastic steps which may interfere with Dr. Jekyll's life, even though he knows something is terribly wrong. Mr. Utterson's rigid nature is exposed to the supernatural through the dreams and premonitions he has as he walks in the streets at night. At the end of chapter 8, Utterson tells Poole, "I shall be back before midnight when we shall send for the police." But this never happens. Does Stevenson want the reader to make their own conclusions? The reader never knows what Mr. Utterson's personal opinions are, and they remain a mystery, and this leaves the reader thinking about the supernatural aspect of the novel.